The term Christian nationalism is just so ill-defined that I think my first question would be, if someone says you're a Christian nationalism, I'd say, okay, please explain to me what you mean by that, and then I will tell you the extent to which that's a fair comment. I think we should just always challenge that term, because it's got so many meanings, and I wouldn't want either to embrace it or to reject it. The strength of Christian nationalism is it forces people to think through what it means for the Lordship of Christ to apply to all of life. And that's got to be a good thing. Like it or not, this term's with us, and we need to understand it and understand how to respond to it. On this area, nuance is quite important.
Well, hello and welcome to another edition of the Evangelical Times podcast. Now, have you ever heard the term Christian nationalism? Well, you should, because it is a term that is often used to attack Christians who believe that all of the Bible applies to all of life. But the ideas of Christian nationalism also do have their risks and their concerns, and to talk about it today, I'm joined by Paul Smith. Paul Smith is a director of ET, book reviews editor of ET, and also the full-time elder at Grace Baptist Church in Broadstairs in Kent. Now, Paul has written a second article in a two-piece series. His first article was looking at Douglas Wilson and why is it that so many Christians are listening to Douglas Wilson. And we had a podcast discussion about that last month. And if you want to listen to that or watch that, then go to our podcast channel and you'll find it there. That's well worth a listen. But today we're talking about what are we to make of Douglas Wilson's Christian nationalism. And that article is published in the current edition, the April 2024 edition of ET, and it's published on page 22 and 23. You can also read it online. But to talk about it with me now is Paul. Paul, thank you for joining us. So, Paul, let's start with those who haven't heard of the term Christian nationalism. What is it, and why should Christians be concerned about it?
Well, if I start with the second part first, we should be concerned about it because we're likely to be called Christian nationalists. So I've recently been seeing that people on both sides of the Atlantic, I thought this is purely an American thing to start with, but actually on this side of the Atlantic as well, a Christian who believes that their faith has an impact on what government should do is dubbed a Christian nationalist. So, for example, a Christian who believes that abortion is wrong would be called a Christian nationalist because they felt that what God said about the sanctity of life should apply to the laws of the land. So that would draw in pretty much all Bible-believing Christians into the sphere of Christian nationalism, although they might think, I'm not a Christian nationalist. So that's one aspect of Christian nationalism. What we might call maybe Christian nationalism proper, if you were to take it from the way that, say, Douglas Wilson would talk about it, he would think about two things, that it would be a nation where there would be a formal public acknowledgement of the Lordship of the Lord Jesus Christ, and second, that they would say that you accept the truth of the Apostles' Creed. So that would be more of what we might say a classic Christian nationalism, that actually there would be God consciously in control of the government by the laws of the Word of God being turned into the laws of the state.
And I suppose then in the United States, this has all been mixed up with Trump supporting evangelicals as well.
It's undoubtedly got caught up in politics, and I mean the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has been described as a Christian nationalist. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs of American politics and wouldn't want to get drawn into that, but you're absolutely right. Those who oppose Trump would want to use Christian nationalism as a smear to support their agenda, and so therefore, like it or not, this term's with us, and we need to understand it and understand how to respond to it.
Normally, Christian nationalism comes with a package of other theological beliefs as well. Can you just talk about some of the other theological beliefs that tend to come with the idea of Christian nationalism and sort of what surrounds it?
Yeah, so it's generally found more in those who would be post-millennial. So we're thinking about the end times and the idea and biblical idea that the earth will be full of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And which Christian would not long for that and pray for that? But a post-millennial view would be a much more optimistic view that there'd be an expansive move of the gospel and that we would see the nations before the second coming of Christ bowing under his lordship. And so that's quite a positive view of the future. It's a post-millennialism mainstream evangelical view, and it's got many different nuances. And not everyone who's a post-millennialist would sign on to Christian nationalism, but there's certainly a synergy between those two views.
So Christian nationalism tends to go with postmillennialism, but just because you are a postmillennialist doesn't mean you're a Christian nationalist. And equally, just because you're a Christian nationalist doesn't necessarily mean you're a postmillennialist. And there may be all sorts of listeners to this podcast and viewers of this podcast who've got all manner of different views about those things. So what for you are the strengths of the idea of Christian nationalism? What can we take from it that you think is helpful and good?
Well, I think that the big point that I think many people are seeing is that the lordship of Christ matters. Now, a few years ago, there was lots of discussion about the I think it's from Schaeffer, the upstairs and downstairs view of the house, that the world is very happy with Christians having a privatized view of Christianity. So it's upstairs in my house, the private rooms, but we don't let it impact our day-to-day lives. And certainly don't want to act self-consciously as Christians in our jobs or in anything to do with the state. And obviously that's highly problematic because God's truth applies to the whole of life. That's the way the Bible presents it. So the strength of Christian nationalism is it forces people to think through what it means for the lordship of Christ to apply to all of life. And that's got to be a good thing. Now, the second thing that is very helpful is, again, coming out of a COVID era, we have seen government overreach. And it's one thing to see government overreach, but it's another thing to think biblically through in what ways has God given powers to government, because clearly the idea of God putting governments in place is there in Romans 13. But sometimes Romans 15 is taken very superficially, and this whole idea of Christian nationalism has allowed and in fact encouraged all believers, whether they sign on for Christian nationalism in whole scale, whether they take parts of it, whether they don't, we've all been forced to try and think through in what ways is government control legitimate.
Recently, Richard Dawkins has said that he regrets the loss of cultural Christianity, even though he spent most of his life attacking the foundations of Christianity. And I think there are perhaps lots of people like that in the country that now beginning to understand the impact of the loss of all the benefits of a Christian foundation to culture. Yet there are, including many Christians, have just not engaged with the culture at all. So one of the benefits of Christian nationalism is the idea that all of the Bible applies to all of life, and we should be thinking biblically in every area, including the area of us as citizens within the state. Paul, you've outlined some of the positives, but you also have concerns. What are some of your concerns about Christian nationalism?
Well, I've been interested in looking back and seeing Christians who've been Christian nationalists in the past. And on these shores, I've done some study at the time of the 17th century and the English civil wars, or more broadly talk about the wars of three kingdoms, because they drew in England, Scotland and Ireland. And there's a battle of Dunbar. It's a tragic battle in 1650 when it pits what we might call Christian nationalists. It's a bit of an anachronistic term because it wasn't used then, in the army of Cromwell with John Owen as his chaplain, against the Covenanter army, with Samuel Rutherford standing very much behind that. And at issue now, the issues are complex and to do with covenants, to do with the king, and do with various things. But what we can say is two armies, both sure of their grounds and wanting a certain application of the rule of the Lord Jesus Christ to government, come to battle. And when we see that in history, I think it just gives us pause for thought to say, how strongly do we want to view this if people who are revered, and both John Owen and Samuel Rutherford are revered in different ways, are coming along opposite sides? And it's not just a debate, this is a full-on battle.
Yeah, so in history, we've seen people who've been attempting to apply their biblical theology to the state actually come to blows on the battlefield and killing each other. And also, I mean, Evangelical Times is a non-conformist newspaper. We have always supported evangelical independency and non-conformity. But in the past, in the history of this country, there have been those who have been in positions of power within the country who've used that as an opportunity to stop nonconformists in various ways, stop nonconformists from joining parliament, to stop them from attending universities. We've had the Test Acts in the past as well. So if you take the idea of Christian nationalism to its extreme and logical conclusion, then you end up actually suppressing the rights of your brothers and sisters in the faith. Yes?
No, yes, that's definitely right. I mean, I think it's not until 1871 that officially non-Anglicans could receive degrees from the universities of Oxford, Cambridge and Durham. I think there's very few universities. It might be London and I think Edinburgh at the time. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There are those significant issues. And I think that's what Douglas Wilson's trying to address when he wants to have the fundamental truth of the Apostles' Creed. So say in Cromwell's England, it was kind of toleration. His idea would be kind of toleration for anyone who's not Roman Catholic. Now, my reading of Wilson, and I may not have got him quite right, but my reading and seeing the Apostles' Creed, he seems to be taking a bit of a broader view than we see Oliver Cromwell taking, because the Apostles' Creed is not an explicitly Protestant document. So I think there's an awareness that there is a difficulty in defining the bounds. So we've got a problem with defining the bounds, but also we've got the flip side problem, as if we try and build up a view of government without a biblical basis, then we run into a lot of trouble. So you talk about Dawkins, and Dawkins wanting cultural Christianity, but it's very difficult to have cultural Christianity without the foundations. So the whole of, some people say, well, I just want to be a classical liberal, but classical liberalism grew out of the seed bed of a very strong Christian worldview in Europe. And it seems to me, looking at the world, that, say, some of the values of democracy, the values of liberalism, democracy, limited governments, these don't tend to transfer very well. And we've got a lot of dictatorships around the world. And when we as Western countries have tried to impose democracy on countries we've invaded, it doesn't seem to have ended particularly well, because it hasn't had the worldview from which a democratic ideal emerged.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been uncomfortable when states try to dictate how man relates to God. I think the role of states is to have some say in how men relate to other men, how people relate to other people, to ensure peace, to ensure the rule of law, and so on, to protect property, to protect borders. But when governments try and get involved in how people should relate to God, then you're on a slippery slope. Yes,
it's very tricky, and then there's obviously elements of that where the decision's got to be made. So, for example, in this country, at one stage we had recusancy fines, which are fines for not attending church, which were applied in greater or lesser extent at some times, and that's kind of enforced belief or enforced compliance, uniformity. But then there's the flip side. We've also had in this country, certainly in my lifetime, I can remember shops not opening on Sunday because of Sunday trading laws. And that would be, we might call, more permissive legislation. So it's creating an environment where people could go to church should they choose to do so. And interestingly, with that kind of law, that was heavily supported by trade unions in the battles in the 1980s, who saw that there was a kind of a general good in having a day off for workers. So again, even on issues of belief, there are there are nuances, because you can't kind of legislate for a day off, but it might be a different day for everyone, because it doesn't quite have the same social impact. So it's complex. It's not just I think some people like to say the first table of the law between God and man, and the second table of the law between man, and I can see the logic of that. But say just on this particular point of the difference between allowing people to worship on Sunday and forcing people to worship on Sunday, there's a bit of an overlap, and there's a bit of nuance.
Yeah, I mean, God's law is one law, and I think any attempt to sort of compartmentalize it always comes unstuck at some point. And I suppose we shall always wrestle with these issues until the Lord returns, and until there is a new world and a new creation. And whilst we live in this world, it'll always be an imperfect form of human government. But it is so important, isn't it, that we as Christians think through these issues. So to summarize then, Paul, are you suggesting that this idea of Christian nationalism, Christians need to be aware of it, because it is being used as a slur against any Christian that believes that all of the Bible applies to all of life? There are good things that we can take from it in terms of thinking through the implications of government and how governments rule over us. But there are dangers as well. And we particularly in Europe, and particularly in the United Kingdom, we've seen those dangers in past centuries work themselves out on the battlefield. And we certainly don't want to get to that point.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say. The only thing I would say is I think the term Christian nationalism is just so ill-defined that I think my first question would be, if someone says you're a Christian nationalism, I say, okay, please explain to me what you mean by that, and then I will tell you the extent to which that's a fair comment. I think we should just always challenge that term, because it's got so many meanings, and I wouldn't want either to embrace it or to reject it, or even to distance myself from other believers on it. So I think that's a sadness to me when you see people say, and they're very keen to write off other believers. Sometimes believers who are wanting to be very, very inclusive, but they'll be extremely caustic and dismissive of others, without necessarily understanding all the nuances of their view as well. And there are some views we might want to distance ourselves from, but on this area, nuance is quite important.
Well, Paul, thank you for your time today. And if you want to know more about this idea of Christian nationalism, if you want to read Paul's article, then simply visit our website, evangelical-times.org.